everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out, braving this unfortunate weather, and coming to be with us here tonight. We're really looking forward to it. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. Before we get started, and while some folks settle in, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Jamie will be around to sign and personalize your books at the alcove next to where you checked in. I'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Mother Island online using the link in the live stream description. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Jamie Figueroa and Jaquira Díaz, who join us tonight to celebrate and discuss Jamie's debut memoir, Mother Island, a cultural coming-of-age story that Melissa Febos described as a lushly written, deeply felt investigation into the meanings of home, lineage, and selfhood. We are so excited to delve into the complex layers of personal identity and belonging, legacy and reclamation, the craft of the memoir, and so much more. So now a bit about tonight's authors. Jamie Figueroa is the author of the critically acclaimed novel Brother, Sister, Mother, Explorer, which was shortlisted for the Reading the West Book Award and longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. A member of the faculty in the MFA Creative Writing program at the Institute of American Indian Arts, Figueroa has published writing in American Short Fiction, Elle, McSweeney's, and the New York Times, among other publications. Boricua by way of Ohio, Figueroa is a longtime resident of northern New Mexico. As I mentioned earlier, Jaquira Díaz joins Jamie in conversation tonight. Jaquira is the author of Ordinary Girls, a memoir, winner of a Whiting Award and finalist for the Lambda Literary Award. Díaz has written for The Atlantic, The Guardian, and T, the New York Times Style magazine, among other publications. She teaches at Columbia University, and her second book, I Am Deliberate, a novel, is forthcoming from Algonquin Books. Okay, that is all from me. Without any further delay, please join me in giving Jamie and Jaquira a very warm welcome.
Thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you, those of you who are joining us from home, watching us virtually. I just want to take this moment to celebrate this huge accomplishment that is Mother Island, a beautiful, beautiful lyrical book. As you mentioned, Melissa Febos called it a deeply felt investigation into the meanings of home, lineage, and selfhood. Miriam Chansey called it a reassemblage, collages fragments of the author's memories from childhood to the present to create a receptacle in which she can recollect, recognize, and claim what it means to be Boricua. I think of it as a kind of excavation, and there's a very personal story, but there's also how that personal story connects with a much larger world and a much larger story of colonialism and displacement, which I, of course, felt very deeply, also being Boricua. I wonder, Jamie, if you could read for us just a little bit from the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. It's lovely to see all of you, and of course, welcome to those folks who are online. It's so special to be here with you.
Thank you. It's special to be here with you. I'm feeling all the feelings, if you can't tell.
We're very excited. Okay, so yes, this is a book about my mother, and it's also a book, like everyone has been saying, the ways in which I've come to put together an identity that is very much my own identity, but having to go through the portal of my mother's homeland, a greater sense of connection with language and culture, and then what's beneath of those layers as well. So I'm sure many of you who are writers or creative people relate to this experience of needing to peel the mask off, right? Anything that is superficial, I'm suspicious of. So this wanting to get behind and beneath what is actually happening, what's motivating this, and through that experience, of course, it's very challenging, this experience of excavation. But it feels like a real ceremonial experience of of getting a greater awareness of what possesses us and how we can be more empowered, more in touch, right? With a true vein of ourselves, right? That is very much a part of the culture and the language that we perhaps are disrupted from, and also it's both a part of that and it's also uniquely unto each one of us, right? So, having said that, I'll just read a little bit from the ending of the first chapter. The stories I haven't been told. I come from fragmented stories, trauma-splintered stories that are not mine to repeat. Too much, too much, too much. I come from children who were abandoned again and again, who grew to be women. I come from women who were held down, women who left their children and took in others. I come from women who fought back, who wielded knives, who shot guns, women who escaped. I come from Taino women and women from West African tribes, brown-skinned and black-skinned women. I come from women who can lie so good they can convince even themselves. Women who were remade unrecognizable. Women who are scared of everything, including themselves. Women who have started over too many times to count. Women who have remained lost. I come from women who were deterred from their own wild knowing. Women who survived. I am here. I am the woman who, by her own hand, through her ancestors' hands, is writing into her remembering.
Wow, thank you. There's, as I said, there's a lyricism that runs through this book, which I often have to pause and like breathe and just think, because it definitely feels like you've thought very deeply, not just excavating these memories and interrogating the memories, but thought very deeply about the meaning of even undertaking an excavation or an interrogation of the memories. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you decided on that as a form, like interrogation and excavation, and how you decided on the structure for this book.
Yeah, I think, when you come from a lineage of rupture, right, it feels like any attempt to reclaim or remake that, I felt like I had to be transparent about the process, right? Also being in the diaspora,
Yeah.
right? It's like, how do I gain enough territory to stand there confidently enough to be sincere, right, about this set of questions that I have? How do I make clear my intention? How am I respectful to myself and to others? And also the way that memory works, the way that relationships work, right? With ourselves, with another, with our mothers, with a greater sense of culture and belonging, just felt like I can't do that in a straight line, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Of course, you know this, but it's like reflecting and sharing, to be very transparent about memories I think I know very clearly. But who can I fact check that way? I call my sister and she's like, yeah, I blacked that out. Those 3 years, I don't remember like exactly how many places we moved. And then, times in my life when I've asked my mother questions about her memories of being in Puerto Rico and just, her laughing. Like, I don't know. And so that's their reality. That belongs to them. And if I'm not satisfied with that, how do I then begin this journey of wanting to have a sense of closeness, right? It's a sense of closeness that's also that sense of belonging. And so I wanted to bring in as much poetic language as I could, I wanted to reference, mythical, archetypal ways of viewing the world and having those experiences to bring to bear to make a kind of sense, right?
And there's also, I think, since you mentioned memories, there's also, I think, this very deliberate choice to mention the archive, or the silences and the violences of the archive.
Yeah.
You reference Carmen Maria Machado, but also Saidiya Hartman, particularly Venus in Two Acts. But I think part of what you're talking about are the silences, or the violence of the archive, and the silences in the archive. And there's this very beautiful section that I just want to read because I feel like y'all need to hear. This very beautiful section when you're talking about discussing Saidiya Hartman's Venus in Two Acts and talking about silences. And this is from page 22 to 23. I consider how silence takes up space. I consider all its shapes, the silence of rupture, the silence of protest, the silence of distance, the silence of waiting, how silence asserts itself, imprints on the body. And I thought, yeah, I feel that. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about silence, and how your feelings about silence, or the way you thought about it, changed during the writing of the book, or how you approached it or thought about it before the book, and how that's different now.
Yeah, there's so many different forms of silence, right? There's like, if we're lucky, the silence where it's like, oh, this is so calming, and I can feel myself, and I can feel something larger than me. And in this silence is sort of the space before I begin to create or respond, right? That's sort of nurturing silence. And then there is the silence that is opposite to that, I would say, enforced silence for hundreds of years.
So I'm feeling some of this. I think part of how I think of the ways that Puerto Rican women specifically were silenced had a lot to do with colonialism, and particularly American colonialism, and how the U.S. Capitalism, and the way that the U.S. came into Puerto Rico, and forced sterilizations of women, but also the ways in which we internalized. We do not talk about this. We don't talk about all of this, all the things that are painful, and all the ways that we were displaced and enslaved, and all the ways that silence was imposed on us as a culture. Is there a way that after writing the book that you feel like you freed yourself from the silence?
I feel like I'm walking in the direction of that, right? I feel like it's going to be a long walk, and I'm committed to it, and I'm definitely on that journey. But I've had moments, I think, since finishing the book where I wonder about epigenetics. I wonder about cultural imprints and history on the island to women, and how that manifests currently in my body right now. And that is something to face with as much compassion and strength as possible, and not just make pretty, make performative. Right?
Yeah, I mean, you do such a great job of kind of returning, as you're remembering, kind of returning to like the purpose of the remembering. How it's not just this is what happened. It's a lot more meaningful than this is just what happened. There's always, this is why I'm doing this. Like, this is a journey of remembering for a reason. Way back in the day, when I first met Jamie, I remember hearing her read, and I thought of her as a fiction writer. And then when I read this book, I was so blown away, and I was like, oh wow, wait a minute. You're definitely an essayist too, and a memoirist, obviously. But is there a way that writing nonfiction is different for you? That writing this book was different? For those of us who know Jamie as a novelist, that writing this book was different than writing a novel.
Yeah, I want to ask you to speak to that too.
I will.
I felt like when I wrote Brother, Sister, Mother, Explorer, I came to realize that it was an emotional autobiography. And then having conversations and all those little Zoom rooms for book tour with like mainly women, mainly Black, Indigenous women of color, talking about where the story came from. And I was talking about everything that's in this book, right? Connecting to them, like this is where this comes from, this sensation of feeling haunted, this lineage of disruption, this need to set yourself free from this kind of chaos that is overtaking you and move towards the light, right? Like all of those, but to not be talking about characters and be talking about myself, I was like, that's a little weird. So in actually writing this book was, yes, different from writing fiction. I had the sense like, this is gonna move quickly. I have a writing practice. I'm in my notebook every day for hours. This essentially is a draft of that. I've written many of this material over and over for the last 10, 15, going on 20 years. That was misguided because, of course, you can have a draft.
Yeah.
But then you're like, but that can be a long way. And, you know, something that I have said at essentially every reading is I've talked about my editor. And I've talked about the gift of having the right editor come forward and help you shape the narrative that you are trying desperately to tell, because it is in the way of you telling any other story. And having Concepcion de Leon and having her be from the Caribbean and having her be able to respectfully and lovingly and as an insider be able to be like, right, there's the things I'm going to tell you as an editor, and then there's this other thing that you don't see happening, or I have a question, and that is so powerful, right? I'm sure you have all experienced when someone has asked you a question, and I don't know what her agenda was, if she had the answer or was, you know, but like sometimes the unraveling of the question and what rises to the surface, which is beyond your control, and it's really unnerving. I mean, you're writing to deadline and you are being remade and reshaped as you are writing in real time on the page. The novel was totally different. I'm like, I have crafted this jewel, right? And with my beloved agent PJ, like, we have this jewel, and what can we do with this jewel? And I have turned every single word over like a stone and decided if I wanted to put it back down or not. And then to have this be in this running flow of movement, water, energy, and trying to figure out how to navigate it and to navigate it on time and to be as, you know, when you write, you're a better sense of yourself, right?
Yeah, I think
We
part
hope
of
to.
part of writing nonfiction, personal narrative of any kind, I think, memoir or personal essay, is not just, yes, I'm putting together a kind of story, but also it's an examination of a life.
Yeah.
And for me, I think I have to, you know, a lot of it happens in therapy, and then I'm like, I have turned this over so much, I'm now ready to write this, like to make art from this.
Yeah.
But you kind of, I think you have to be ready to do the hard work of looking inward, and telling the truth, not just about what happened and, you know, about the events, the situation, if you will, but telling the truth about yourself, like learning the truth about yourself,
Yes.
discovering the truth about yourself, and then somehow making that into art, which I think is a lot more difficult and also rewarding than writing fiction. And I consider myself a novelist who wrote a memoir, but a novelist.
But don't you feel like when you tell students, at least this is something that I find myself telling my students, which I'm also telling myself, is like something about you also has to change in the writing. Like, yes, there's the arc of the work, and you know it to a certain extent, but if you come out the end of that the same as you went in, just in the writing of it, something didn't work.
Then it's only a draft.
Yes.
And you haven't finished.
Exactly. And so you have to surrender to that.
Yeah. I feel like part of writing nonfiction for me is entering the work knowing that there's something I need to discover, that I don't know what I've come to say, and that I'll discover that somewhere in the writing process. And often when I think I'm done with a draft, I come back and I'm like, wait a minute, have I said what I've come to the page to say, or do I just think, have I just convinced myself that this is what I came to say? Is there something else that I'm not necessarily seeing? And I have to constantly do this work of asking myself questions and then putting the work down and then returning to it and trying to discover something that's a lot more meaningful. And often when you've done it, you kind of feel like I've been drained and deflated and I need to sleep for 3 months. But I think I always know when I've done it. I always feel like, yes, this is what I came to say. But I never know before I start writing.
Yeah. Yes. So true.
Did you we were talking a little bit backstage in the green room. About, yeah, that's a real place. We were talking about how the writing of memoir, or how writing this book, like you felt like you had to do it before you moved on to other projects. Can you talk a little bit about that? About how this book kind of, I don't know if it took over your life, like my memoir took over my life, or how you needed to write it to get it out of the way or be done with it in a way so that you could move on to other kinds of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going back to also the previous question you asked about sort of coming out the other end and being different. And I just wanted to say that there's something I think that becomes more sobering about the reality of the relationship I have with my mother. There's like this stark light now that is just undeniable. It is exactly as it is. It's, you know, in that black and white on the page. And also the experience of being mothered continuously by many forces that are surrounding me and inside of me that are loving and nurturing and consistent, has also, that my experience of that has grown tremendously. And so to your last question around, I just felt like, what if I become the writer who keeps writing the same exact book? I know that works for some writers. It's like, that is their career. And there's really great books that come out of that one obsession. And I don't know if I will be that writer, but if I stand a chance of doing anything else, I knew that I had to tell this story, which possessed my mother's life, what happened to her as a child, has run her entire life. And bled into my life and then ran my life, and to the point where, you know, I would show up for therapy and be like, you know, I'm sure you can imagine if you haven't had the direct experience of settling in with a new therapist, and it's like, okay, where do I begin? With my mother's story. There's something off about that, and it took me well into my late 30s to get a handle on that. I think what I also was trying to say, now I can sort of come to my defense a bit in that and say, I am someone who by nature is connected to lineage. And when I'm telling you a story that doesn't start with me, what I'm trying to get you to understand is that I am sitting in front of you and there are many generations present.
That's very Puerto Rican.
Yes.
That is very, very Puerto Rican. I had a similar experience when I was writing. Like I said, I consider myself primarily a novelist, and I kept returning to the stuff that's in the memoir. No matter how I tried to veil it and shape it and change it, it was always about my mother, about my family, about Puerto Rico, and it kept coming up in a number of ways. So I felt like I have to write this memoir before I can do anything else, because it won't let me go, because every other thing I try to write is just the truth. And now I feel like I have kind of moved on, but all the essays I write feel memoir adjacent. Kind of thinking about claiming Puerto Rico, which is the subtitle of the book, Mother Island, A Daughter Claims Puerto Rico. I would love for us to talk a little bit about that journey, which feels so important throughout the book, and a return to language the language of Puerto Rico, but also a reckoning with race and the ways that you were taught to assimilate or expected to hide the things about you that might be racialized. I wonder, I'd love to hear about this journey to reconnect with language and to reckon with language and race in the book.
Yeah, I've spent more recently time trying to learn Taino, and there's many efforts, but there are two dialects, Hiwatahia and Taino Naiki, and there are various groups of people who you can take classes with, and also free online, and there's this word called ni Taino, which means water relatives, which points to something very obvious, which is within language there's a whole consciousness, right? And if we think about being in the Caribbean, and if we are moving around, and as we're moving around, when we come ashore, we are saying to whoever we are coming to ashore to with, I'm recognizing you as a relative. That's very different than a group of islands that has been colonized by various forces, that has a structure of official, unofficial hierarchy, right? So that's really interesting to me. Am I ever going to sit around and be able to speak in Taino? I don't know. I don't think so. I can hope to, and I can try. But what I'm really interested in is the story that's present in every single word. And even though this is an attempt to put together a language that was lost by looking at sister languages and documentation, and even the documentation is from who was coming to the island, when, to buy and sell what, so the vocabulary is limited. But any way of dropping in to a closer, deeper sense of this language that carries with it its own knowing. And how am I at a lack for the gaps in that knowing? And even if I only know 3 words, 4 words, 5 words, that changes my reality, right?
Yeah. There are some beautiful passages in the book that are definitely, I think, make me feel what it is to be a Puerto Rican person who has essentially lost part of that language and gained Spanish, which is a colonial language, even though it's primarily the language of Puerto Rico, and English, which is also a colonial language. To be writing in a mix, like I'm a bilingual person who writes primarily in English but also in Spanish, a mix of 2 colonial languages, and feeling like both of them are kind of a translation of the self in a way, and kind of having to be at peace with that. So it feels like the reclamation of language, or the trying to learn, the journey of learning a language, definitely feels in the book like it's also part of the excavation, trying to learn or know, reconnect with the self. Can you also talk a little bit about how that journey, that reckoning with race also happened?
Yeah, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do you have other arts practices that aren't just writing? Do you have a space where you go beyond language to feel some sense of connection and expression?
I cook. Also very Puerto Rican. But yeah, I cook, and I tend to think of cooking as meditative and as something that I try to do to connect with. I cook mostly Puerto Rican food.
Okay.
So I used to cook with my abuela in her kitchen, and she taught me how to cook. And like the process of making something to feed other people feels to me like, in some ways, like an expression of love, but also liberating. Like I am my truest self in the kitchen when I'm cooking for Puerto Rican food for other people. Not really artistic, but I think of it as artistic. What do you all think?
Yeah, it's artistic. It's an art.
In agreement, in total agreement. Absolutely.
My partner is British, and we spend a lot of time in the UK with their family. And so the first time I went to meet their family, I was like, am I really gonna feel okay cooking for a bunch of white people? And then I cooked for them and they loved it, and now every Christmas I cook and they're like, I can't imagine Christmas without Berlin. Imagine British people saying Berlin. Yeah, it sounds like that. But it has always felt to me like a way of connecting when you don't really know how to connect in other ways. Like there's how to bridge gaps, if you will.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, and I absolutely agree with it being an art form, and I feel like for as long as I've been writing, many decades unto myself, and then coming out and sharing that more and more, there's a space also around like movement, like feeling like there's something ritualistic, there's something that goes beyond all of the languaging to the body just moving itself through space. I want to say dancing, but sometimes that feels like then there's too much pressure. Then it's like, what kind of dance do you do? It's like, can I just like feel this transmission of rhythm and
Perreo.
So like there's the spaces where we can go right beyond language when it feels like there's so much limitation, and how do I actually say something that is authentically mine in a voice that is both mine and is also surprising to me because it's just on the edge of where I am becoming, right? And I don't feel like, right, I'm thinking about Audre Lorde and the master's tools and all of that. How do we again work within educational systems that are deeply traumatizing to whole groups of people and use it as a force of liberation, because learning, especially in indigenous cultures all around the world, is a natural form of ongoing consciousness changing evolution for a human being. And then we put those into structures and then we want to control them and all of that happens. But reclaiming learning and the process of learning and being in those institutions and having students come to you and admire you and feel like you're in collaboration with them to set them free is a huge experience.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I see that in you, and I remember we've had conversations about this. It's been some years since we've been together, but I just remember sharing a story, which I'm not going to go into in this moment, but feeling really passionate about how we advocate for particular students who are not typically seen and included in the classroom.
Yeah, I remember this conversation. It also led to an argument with a person of the dominant culture who was listening to our conversation, and I was like, this was not about you. So I think we, I guess, can open it up to questions from the audience. I also have some additional questions, but I'll save them because I just want to give everyone else an opportunity to ask questions. And if you could speak up, I'm hard of hearing, so if you could speak up and I'll repeat the question for everyone and for people who are joining us virtually. Hi.
So I have a question. You touched on it previously, so I had to think of the second question. What I loved about your first book was that place was very prominent in that book, and the way you wrote it was through a very indigenous lens, through the feelings of like being viewed as othered and fetishization. And I'm curious as to how you approached place in this novel and how you used like the folklore to tell this story.
So the question was, how did you approach place in this novel, and how did you use folklore to tell this story? Right? Did I miss anything?
Yes.
Okay.
I came to understand how much place influenced the physicality of my mother, even though she left when she was 8 or 9 and didn't go back until she was in her 60s. When I went for the first time in 2010, January 2010, the thing that I was most taken with was that I was on the island, I was in Rio Piedras, and I was seeing, hearing, feeling my mother. And again, sometimes I say things and I'm like, well, that actually sounds really obvious, but it was tremendous to have this experience of, I know this place through the body of my mother. That's the influence and the impact of place on us. The places that we come from, the places that we fall in love with, that fall in love with us, that we feel like we can't ever be gone from for very long before they call us back. And I think about, as much as I can, right, the perspective of place. In the novel, it was, I want to give this place a voice and think about if we are trying to get back to a place of realizing our humanity and being more fully in that space, then that means that we're in relationship and I'm not just acting upon you. There is a reciprocation that is happening. There's another perspective that's joining my perspective, and place is absolutely warrant of that presence. Yeah, I think also in really looking closely at the time that I've spent on the island, and also being very clear about the space that I occupy, which is a space in the diaspora. And then what does that mean, you know? So that's a little bit of trying to answer some of that question. It absolutely does come into focus in this book as well, in a different but similar way, I think, than the novel.
Did you have to do any research in order to write about Puerto Rico, either before or after your travel there?
When I was there in 2010, I was at La UP in Rio Piedras, and there were several classes that I was taking about culture and history and language, and I was the laughing stock of my language class, and I was the only Puerto Rican in that class. Everyone else were like students from upstate New York, and I just was like, I remember one day they were trying to get me to do this language exercise. I was having a really hard time understanding. And I said something the way that my mother would say it to me, just siéntese. And everyone's looking at me like, what is she saying? What's happening? Like, she's trying to put this command in this place where it doesn't belong, and is she telling somebody to sit down? And like, what is actually happening? And it was a total disaster and completely humiliating. And there's a part in the book where I'm actually speaking to the Spanish language about times we have been close, and times I feel like can understand, and then times where I'm like, we're never gonna work out, are we? No matter how many times I try, it's just gonna fall apart, and we're gonna humiliate each other, and all of this. But there was a lot of time that I spent on the island, and I was doing, I had to do reflections on all of the information that I was learning, and I had all of that material, which I pulled from. So some of that was just directly from the learnings and the teachings that I had at that time.
Okay. If you're in Puerto Rico, you don't get to laugh. That's all I'm saying. Other questions?
But I will also say that my mother came to the States, to New York, and then was very soon after put into a Catholic orphanage on Staten Island and was punished for speaking Spanish. And I had a moment, right? Several moments of being like, wow, this is hard. I'm much older than my mother was and can figure out how to be in good humor about this. But like, to be a child, to be in a space where you are consistently punished, smacked, abused for being who you are, where you come from, and speaking the language is a brutal devastation.
And it's no wonder that part of the way that she survived that was to try to erase everything about herself, including language, but also anything about her that might be racialized.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Other questions?
I have a question. So, can you talk a little bit, you opened up by reading about the stories that you were not told, and I'm really curious about the role of magic in manifesting memory. Can you talk about how maybe the writing process or your process and your relationship to magic and how that helped you remember yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Can we repeat the question? I'm just gonna repeat the question for the virtual audience. So the question was about, let's see if I get this, all of this, about magic and manifesting memory. Can you talk about the role of magic in manifesting memory? Did I get all of that?
Remembering.
In remembering.
Yeah, yourself.
Yeah, you know, in shamanic cultures around the world, whenever there is dismemberment, what follows that is a process of rememberment. So, I've been thinking about that in a lot of different ways in my life. When things are taken away from us, what is our active call to fill back in? And how do we do that? And I think there's something magical about writing anyway, right? That we're taking from our senses, from our experience, and somehow we are fashioning it into language, right? But I think that there's something about conjuring a world, especially that happens in fiction, right? But to borrow from that experience in our own lives, in the recreation of our lives, right? There's a way in which I was conjuring memory, and the way in which I could conjure sort of met in the middle and got close to something that felt very true. And that was also an act of rememberment or repair in the face of so much rupture, right? And there's something that you asked earlier about racialization and coming to this understanding. And I just want to say very briefly that so much of that was intellectualized, right? Around what I call myself as a multiracial person, and trying to get clear about I am leading with the identities that have been historically silenced, and also within my family that have been erased. I'm leading with that as a way to remember and have a sense of wholeness and rememberment, and also as a way to bring dignity and honoring to my lineage. And also, you know, it was very late in the game of the edits in the book, and a question was asked of me, which was, I'm going to share this because I share this a lot, where my editor was like, I've been reading this very closely and we've been working together, and is it okay that, I'm like, no, I'm asking you, is it okay that I ask this, that I share this question that you asked? And she asked me, I still don't understand, when you look in the mirror, what do you see? And I was like, okay, I'll talk to you tomorrow. And then I was like, therapist, shamanic healer, curandera, like calling all the people, because something was undone in me by that question. And I had to write for pages around what is it to see, and how do other groups of people see themselves, and why is it that to see my mother was to betray her? And what word can I use that actually feels authentically mine to use? How do I recognize myself? Because half of the time, you know, as a young person, I would walk by a storefront window and be like, who is that? And that was my image. I was that distanced from myself, because everywhere I looked were white people, light-skinned people. There was no other, outside of our home, there was no other, you know, Puerto Ricans, there were no other people of color. So I was getting no reflection back. So how do I recognize myself? You know?
Wow. That feels so painful. I mean, as a multiracial person myself, who grew up in a black family, my abuela who raised us was black, and she was consistently always reminding us we are a Black family no matter what you see in the mirror, because the world will treat us like we're a Black family. And because she was a visibly Black person, and she knew what racism was because she experienced it every day. And the way that I saw myself in the mirror was, I understood very early, no one necessarily sees me as Black until I'm with my abuela, until we're in a family. But I felt like this like responsibility to correct people when we walked in the world and people were like, who's that? Is that your nanny? And I was like, what did you say? How dare you? And I was like always angry, like I carried this what felt like a responsibility to correct people, to ensure that people understood that our Blackness was beautiful and our Blackness was love. And part of that was because she made sure like that we went out into the world and experienced life this way, that we understood who we were. And I think part of it for her was because she grew up in a place that was predominantly Black, and then in her adult life left, her pueblo in Nahuatl left, and then experienced racism from the world, right? But also in her own family, because my mother and my mother's family were white, and my maternal grandmother was violently, vocally racist in front of everyone without shame. And she wanted us to make sure that we were not harmed by that racism, that we had a sense of pride and love in who we were. And I don't know what I would have done without a grandmother who loved us and celebrated us the way that she did. That to me just sounds so painful. Yeah.
There's only my grandfather's mother who there's just little whispers of in my mother's story about the island that feels like a force of love to kind of, again in my imagination, conjure and bring forward. But yeah, it's a really challenging, difficult place. And the experience that I had from my mother was, you have these cousins on the island and they are so dark. And it was like, the inherent message there is to distance yourself as much as possible, and what is also there is, these are your family, this is you. But that way of thinking took, when you live with a dominant culture at you at every moment, you can set that a little bit aside, and just it creates a division, right? So how much can you tolerate that division? My mother has tolerated it a great deal, and I am working on my tolerance level of that.
Wow. Any other questions? Feel free all to join us in conversation. Hi.
I just 2 questions. I have 5, but I'll start with 2. I know we're limited in time, but I wanted to know if you have a poetry background, because you have a cadence in the way you both speak, but you primarily, and as a fellow Boricua, it feels like home right now. And I feel like we're in our sala right now talking, and I wish it could be longer. And my second question, I kind of contrived both of your memoirs as like sister books, and I wanted to know, did you both aim to honor and forgive your Boricua mothers? Sorry,
we talked a little bit about this backstage too.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah. It's all about you. We're here for you.
I'm sorry, I just got so caught in like forgiveness. Do you know what's happening to me right now is actually I'm getting a visual in my mind, which I'll explain to you. It's my mother, and then it's behind her, right? Her mother. It's through my mother line. It's that lineage, right? And all of the mothers. And it's like this infinite line. And I think there is a reconciling for me around this is the way things are, and how do you make peace with that? How do you make the best decisions that are healthiest for you to include yourself in your life? And surround yourself with people who treat you in a way that's respectful and kind and caring. And forgiveness, like release, is absolutely something that I have engaged in a practice of continuing to release. And it's very much tied in with expectations, right? I think part of writing this book and trying to see it from many different points of view and kind of hold my mother like a prism up to the light was to develop a deeper sense of compassion for her as a human being who also happened to have 3 daughters, of which I am the youngest. Does that mean that I'm like, Mom, come to visit, we're gonna like sit on the couch and snuggle? Like, no, I'm sorry, that's not gonna happen. You know? Do I hold anything against you? No. Do I love you? All of my lifetimes. Do I release you from everything that you did that caused harm and continue to do? Of course. And she is a mystery. She's a force, she's a whole multiverse in a human body. And I had an experience of her as her youngest daughter. She's much more than anything that I could ever say about her, as am I, and her experience of me. And I feel like that's coming to a level of also with what is and how to show true respect. And I don't know what to do beyond that.
You're a poet.
You are a poet. I started off as a wannabe poet. Thank you for your question, Sarita. I do feel like our books are really very much in conversation. I do. And I also did not write my book. Forgiving my mother was not like on my list of things to do when I started writing my book. I actually wrote several chapters that even though my mother was alive and existed and was in the room, I completely wrote around her and didn't do that consciously. It wasn't until a friend who read like 5 chapters, sat down and was like, wait a minute, where's your mother? How come you don't even mention her? Was she alive? That I realized, wait a minute, I thought I was writing a book with my mother in it and then realized I was avoiding writing about her, even though in my fiction was all about mothers, and it was all about terrible mothers, great mothers, ghost mothers, mothers with babies. It was all about motherhood, and I am not a mother and never wanted to be. But it was the process of writing the book and the having to imagine what my mother's life was like when she was my age. She was a very young mother. She got married when she was 15 and had 3 children by the time she was 22 and also suffered from schizophrenia and addiction. And so for me, having to really think about what life was like for her and what life might have been like if she didn't suffer from mental illness. And when I say suffer, she did suffer. Thinking about how different she would have been and what kind of person she might have been if she had the kind of opportunities I had and mental health care and didn't suffer from addiction. I thought it is almost like we could have been the same person. And so the process of forgiveness for me started with the writing of the book. And also now when I see her and talk to her, I talk to her on the phone almost every day. When I see her and talk to her, I have to enter every single conversation knowing that by the end of it, I will have to forgive her again. And so forgiveness is like every single day. And I think, I'm not a masochist, but I think that I need to be ready, willing to do that kind of forgiving every time I set off on the journey of even having a 5-minute conversation. And so while I think I'm very willing to forgive her, I also think it is really difficult to have to do that every single day. Maybe I'll write another book. I don't know.
Yes, please, all the books, all the stories.
We have time for one more question in the back.
Yes, it's so funny that you say that about you talking about your mom, because I remember when I was reading your book, at some point, maybe 3/4 in it, I went to the acknowledgments and said she didn't thank her mother. I was like, that's a tell. So
I dedicated the book to her though.
I was like, I just looked, I was like, she's not in there. Okay. But what I wanted to know is how did you take care of yourself? Actually, both of you. Like, how did you take care of yourself as you're writing?
Thank you for that question. The question is, how did we both take care of ourselves while we were writing? Jamie, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think it was being really clear about delineating space, right? When I go to write, I feel like I'm going down and I feel like I'm going back in my body. And I feel like it's an altering of consciousness, right? And so being very clear about, to a large extent, this is ceremonial work. This is spiritual work. This is how do I transition from hanging out with my son and reading him stories to a completely different place and space that I occupy within, right? So I would do things that would help me shift that space.
Get grounded.
Get really grounded. And then I would watch how long I sat and how much I got up and moved around and stretched, right? There's so much I feel like is in our entire body that has stories to tell behind our knee and between our toes, right? Like the back of our ears. So just sitting in a chair and just thinking and being in headspace actually doesn't get at all of the ways of iterating and telling stories. So having movement and trying to have some sense of balance and all of those things. It was also really hard because I wrote most of it while I was in another country and I didn't have like my community and I didn't have like the person who touches my body and heals me and who knows my body, and a lot of that was hard. So it was balance between being alone in a corner at a desk with being outside and looking up and like beholding the moon, Garaya, right? And then Taino, Tai Garaya is good evening, right? That we're including the moon in that and remembering to have that kind of expansiveness after this kind of orientation, I think was the biggest way to take care of myself.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I did not take care of myself at all while writing. I thought I was fine. I was good, and that's why it took me 12 years. I had to keep putting it away and writing other things, and I will not write a book like that again. It almost destroyed me. I mean, by the end of it, my hair started falling out. I wasn't sleeping. I ended up in the hospital. That last year before we sold it was really difficult, in part because I thought I was fine. I insisted that I was fine, and I wasn't. And I'm a person who I've suffered from anxiety and major depressive disorder my whole life since I was 11, and I insisted that I was fine, and then started therapy afterward. And now writing is so different. Writing is joyful, even when I'm writing about terrible, traumatic things, because I'm taking care of myself now. Now writing feels like a gift. Like even when I'm writing about something about trauma, it feels like I'm making a gift for someone else with this, and it feeds me rather than taking anything away. Which feels similar to teaching. When I'm teaching, I feel like I'm my very best self in the classroom because I'm taking care of myself. and so now, this novel I'm just finishing that my editor's waiting for, which has taken me about 3 years, was a much more difficult book in terms of craft, but it only took me 3 years compared to 12 because I was taking care of myself, and I feel like I was in control of how the writing went, how my life was going. Now my life feels like it's full of love and friendship and wonderful things. And a huge part of that has been therapy, but also making sure that I understand that there are boundaries, that the writing is, it's work and it's art making, but it's also work. So I set a schedule and I write during those times, and the rest of the time it's for living, actually living. During that first book, all I was doing, I was throwing everything, my whole life, into the work. And I realized in those years, I was not living. I was just writing. And so now it's the opposite. I write when I make time for it, and the rest of the time is spent living. And I wish that I had discovered this 20 years ago. Thank you for that question. My advice to you all is definitely take care of yourselves, that you are much more important than the book, if you're writers. Other ways that I take care of myself now is I read a lot more than I write. I read Jamie's book. I am constantly reading. I read before bed. I read when I get up in the morning. It feeds me. And it's so helpful. Thank you so much for that question. I think we're out of time. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all so much for coming out. God, I feel like sometimes the hardest part of my job is cutting you guys off after an hour, because it's conversations like these that I wish could go on for hours and hours and hours, but unfortunately we all have to go home eventually. So thank you all so much for coming out. Thank you to everyone who asked questions and participated in tonight's conversation. Thank you to Jaquira for moderating such a rich conversation tonight. And thank you to Jamie for celebrating this incredible launch with us. So just a few final reminders before we wrap up. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can buy a copy of Mother Island by clicking the link in the live stream description. For those of you with us tonight, we have plenty of additional copies available for purchase at the register if you haven't gotten yours already. We also have copies of Ordinary Girls and Jamie's novel that I'm gonna mix up the words in the title. Brother, Sister, Mother, Explorer. As someone said earlier, these are both such fantastic accompanying reads to Mother Island, and their covers all look so beautiful next to each other. So I highly recommend checking those out. Jamie will be around to sign and personalize your books. That's gonna be happening at the little alcove where my coworkers are pointing to. So we ask that you all please gather all of your personal belongings with you, line up down this center aisle more or less, and head around to the wall. And that is all we have for you tonight. Thank you again for coming out. Let's give these two one last round.